Today, we're going to unpack a really powerful legal thinking tool by diving into a dramatic and honestly pretty heartbreaking court case from the 18th century. It's a story about a sailor, a very high-stakes promise, and a devastating verdict that all came down to one single crucial detail. So, let me start by asking you this. Imagine you finish 90% of a huge project, but then something happens that stops you from finishing that last 10%. Should you get paid for all the work you did, or should you get absolutely nothing? Now, today, the answer seems kind of obvious, right? But the law, back in the 18th century, well, it had a much harsher view. Okay, let's get into the facts of the case. So picture this, August 2nd, 1795. A ship called the Governor Perry leaves Jamaica headed for Liverpool, England. The second mate on board is a man named Mr. Cutter. But then, tragically, on September 20th, Mr. Cutter dies while they're still at sea. And, get this, the ship pulls into Liverpool just 19 days later. He was so incredibly close. So, why did this personal tragedy end up becoming such a landmark legal case? Well, it all boiled down to the very specific deal Mr. Cutter struck before the voyage even began. It was, as it turns out, a very fateful bargain. Okay, here's the absolute core of the problem. Mr. Cutter promised to work for the entire voyage, from start to finish. In exchange, Captain Powell promised to pay him 30 guineas. Now, to put that into perspective, this was a massive amount of money, about 4 times what a sailor in his position would normally make for a trip like that. It was a classic high-risk, high-reward deal, and that high-reward part is absolutely crucial.
So how in the world did the court make sense of this deal gone so wrong? Well, we can actually understand their thinking by using a classic tool for legal analysis called IRAC. You can think of it like a lawyer's compass. It's a framework that helps you navigate through a complex, messy problem and find a clear, logical path forward.
At its heart, IRAC is a really simple but incredibly powerful method. It just gives you a structured, step-by-step path to get from a problem to a solution. And honestly, its logic is super useful far beyond any courtroom, really for any situation that requires clear, rigorous thinking. So, IRAC breaks down into 4 simple steps. First, you identify the issue. What's the actual question here? Second, you find the rule. What's the relevant law or principle? Third is the application. How does that rule apply to the specific facts of this situation? And finally, you reach a conclusion. What's the logical outcome? So, let's use this exact framework to solve the puzzle of Mr. Cutter's contract.
All right, let's start with the first step, I for issue. What was the fundamental legal question that the court had to answer in this case?
And there it is. That's the core issue. After Mr. Cutter died, his widow sued Captain Powell for a portion of the payment. I mean, her argument was simple. He completed most of the journey, he did most of the work. The court had to decide, was she entitled to any payment at all for the work her husband did manage to complete?
Now that we've nailed down the issue, we can move to the real heart of the IRAC analysis, figuring out the governing rule and then applying it to the facts of Mr. Cutter's situation.
So the governing rule at the time was a doctrine called strict performance. And let me tell you, back in 1795, the law was tough. It was incredibly rigid. It basically demanded that to get paid under a contract, a person had to perform their duty exactly as promised, completely, perfectly, with no deviation. There was really no room for almost done.
Okay, now for the application. The court's job was to decide if this was an entire contract or a severable contract. An entire contract is just what it sounds like, all or nothing. You do the whole thing, you get paid. You don't, you get nothing. A severable contract is different. You can get paid for the parts you complete. So what was the key piece of evidence? It was the money. Why was Captain Powell offering 4 times the normal salary? The court reasoned this wasn't just a wage, it was a bonus, a specific prize being offered only if Cutter completed the entire voyage. By accepting that huge potential payday, Cutter was also implicitly accepting the huge risk that came along with it.
So, we've identified the issue, we've found the rule, and we've applied it to the facts. All that's left now is C, the final logical conclusion, and it's a harsh one.
The court concluded that Mrs. Cutter was entitled to nothing. 0. Not a single penny. Because her husband had not performed his entire obligation, his estate wasn't entitled to any part of the payment, not even for the 2 months of hard work he successfully put in.
This quote from the Chief Justice at the time just perfectly sums up the court's cold, hard logic. The larger sum was specifically tied to the whole voyage. You see, Mr. Cutter had made a very specific kind of wager. He gambled that he could survive the entire journey in exchange for a massive payday. And tragically, for him and his family, it was a bet that he lost.
So you might be thinking, okay, why does a shipping contract dispute from over 200 years ago still matter to us today? Well, it matters because this case and the IRAC framework we just used to analyze it have a really powerful and lasting legacy.
So what are the key things to take away from all this? First, this case is a classic, textbook example of that all-or-nothing principle, which became known as the doctrine of entire contracts. Second, it's a pretty stark reminder of just how critical it is to have crystal-clear terms in any agreement. Now, thankfully, modern law has evolved to be a lot more flexible and often allows for partial payment in cases like this. But the IRAC framework itself, that remains an absolutely invaluable tool for clear, logical thinking, a way to find structure in pretty much any complex problem you face.
Which kind of brings us to a final question. The court's ruling was definitely harsh, but it was based entirely on the specific terms of the deal. It really forces us to think about the promises we make. You know, when we agree to do something, have we agreed to deliver the whole, complete result, or just our best effort? It's a question of when nearly there is exactly the same as nowhere near.